So our next speaker for the evening is Sifra Lentin. Sifra is a Mumbai-based writer and the Bombay History Fellow at Gateway House, a foreign policy think tank in Mumbai. She was awarded the 2018-19 Herbert Katz Fellowship for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania for her ongoing project on Karachi's Jewish community. Her most recent book is titled Mercantile Bombay, A Journey of Trade, Finance and Enterprise. She's also on the board of trustees of the Sir Jacob Sassoon School in Mumbai. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Sifra.
Thank you, everyone. And before I begin, I'd like to thank Sarmaya for hosting me today. It's the first time I'm here. And seeing the crowd and the setting and the collection, it's been a privilege. I'd also like to thank Robert on the very fun and knowledgeable talk that he gave on Mumbai. And I've been wanting to hear Robert ever since the book released and his first Avid function, and I told him so when we spoke, trying to find convergences between our talks. Now, I'm going to talk about Bombay's Jewish community, diaspora, identity, and history. Now, it's a serious talk. It's not like Robert said, I'm going to joke about it, but I'm going to try and make it sort of as accessible and light to my audience. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'd really like to hear them, because the talk today is more on the Baghdadi Jewish community rather than on the Ben Israeli community, which is a community I belong to. So I'm a Ben Israel Jew. Both my parents are Ben Israeli, and we are the Marathi speaking, and in the colonial period, we were called the native Jews of Bombay. So I thought that probably you all would be interested. I should focus here more on the Baghdadi merchant community, largely because there are so many institutions which have been contributed by them. And I will talk a little also about the Ben Israelis and how the history interweaves with the Baghdadi community. Now, the histories are very different. They're culturally very different. But today, both communities have come together. So you all can ask me questions. How did they mix? What were the kind of politics during the early 20th century? So I'd be happy to answer it, because I wasn't able to really integrate it all into this talk. So now, as I've said, the title is up, and this period of 150 years that I'm going to be talking about, from the 19th to the mid-20th century, is actually the period when the Jewish community of Bombay grew, flourished, and reached a peak by 1941. Now, in 1941, in the census of India, it was recorded that there were 22,000 plus Jews all over India. And by the 2011 census, we have under 5,000 Jews today, and maybe even less. What happened after 1941? There were two major events that took place. And I've been sort of emphasizing on this right from day one. There was a huge immigration out of India after 47. So the Baghdadi Jewish community decided to immigrate to England. Some went to Israel. Israel was still not formed as a nation then. And they went to Australia, and they went to America. The Indian Jews, that is the Ben Israeli Jews, they too decided to undertake Aliyah. Aliyah is a return to the Holy Land. So if you are a religious or a conservative Jew, in every prayer ever since the Jews lost their homeland, they say next year in Jerusalem. So because the Ben Israeli Jews were also a religious community, they decided also to uproot themselves after almost 2,000 years of settling in the Konkan and in Bombay from the 19th century to undertake Aliyah. So today we have a community of almost 80 to 85,000 Indian Jews in Israel. And I'm amongst the very few that are left behind here. So the focus of my lecture is actually the Baghdadi Jewish community, but I'll be happy to take questions on the Ben Israelis. And it is largely on how they came here, how they arrived here, the early history, right from the Geniza traders to how they came to Surat and then Bombay. And it is in the context of my recent book, Mercantile Bombay, A Journey of Trade, Finance and Enterprise, which is part of the Gateway House Guide to India in the 2020s. Now, in Mercantile Bombay, I have a chapter on the economic and the cultural contribution of foreign immigrant communities, merchant communities. In fact, people who follow me on Instagram and all, there was one person on Twitter who said, why is it that you always talk about merchant communities? Why not about other communities, artisans, coolies, blah, blah, blah? And I turned around and said, my interest, and the interest of my book is in the economic history of the city. Yes, these communities have also contributed. You see, an entrepreneur cannot do everything on his own. You have a support structure. But the focus here in Mercantile Bombay was on merchant communities, both immigrant, like the Baghdadi Jews, and migrant communities from within India. Now, although my focus is on the merchant community, Jewish community, I will be weaving in wherever relevant the history of Bombay's native Jews, the Ben Israel or the children of Israel. We are considered one of the lost 10 tribes of the Kingdom of Israel. And we settled 1,600 years ago in the Konkan coastal region in what is today Raigad district, just south of Mumbai. But we came to Bombay only in the 19th century, when the English company was running Bombay, and they were encouraging communities to come and settle in the city. Another thing I want to bring out is that we were known as the Saturday oil pressers or the Shanivar Telis of the Konkan, because it appears that the early history of the community, most of them, every village in the Konkan had a Teli. You either were a Muslim Teli or a Hindu Teli, or you were a Shanivar Teli. So this is a profession the community is most identified with. Now, I just wanted to highlight some aspects of both communities, which both communities really share in common. One is the history of both communities are deeply connected to the seas. So the Ben Israelis, we don't have any evidence or material evidence of how we arrived in India. But we were shipwrecked. The oral history is that we were shipwrecked at Naugao. There's a memorial to my ancestors at Naugao, a modern memorial, and the oldest cemetery is on Naugao Beach. The Baghdadi Jewish network also is a maritime trading network. So I call them the Geniza Jews. Now, what is a Geniza? I mean, there's been a lot of work. I don't know for those who are aware of it, but S.D. Goitin and Mordecai Friedman wrote a beautiful book on the India traders. The Geniza network are medieval Jewish traders who worked or traded along the maritime trading routes from the 9th century onwards. Now, any letter by a religious Jew which has the name of God is never ever disposed or torn or thrown away. It is always put in a Geniza room in a synagogue. So it so happened that the synagogue at Fustat in Old Cairo had this room full of really old letters written in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, in Hebrew script, which were interpreted over like 20, 30, 40 years by people. The collection is all over the world, and I will show you I'll show you a picture of one of the letters. And these were the traders. The Baghdadi Jews were part of the Geniza network as I call it, or the Indian Ocean Trading Network. The second thing is that colonial Bombay became a nerve center for both communities religiously, in terms of being a community hub, and for cultural life of both communities in the 19th and 20th century. Now, from a time where the Baghdadi Jews were sort of dispersed all across the Indian Ocean port cities, Bombay seemed to attract them, and I will tell you why a little later on. And a lot of the institutions that were built by the Sassoon family became a model for later outposts like Shanghai, like Yokohama, wherever they settled or opened outposts or major branches and there was a large community, the same Bombay model was replicated. The second thing is that Jews in India have never faced any kind of anti-Semitism here, except in Portuguese enclaves. And that too, we are not talking about the Baghdadi Jews or the Ben Israeli Jews. We are talking about the Maritime Jews, or the Jews who converted to Christianity and came to work in Portuguese enclaves like Goa and Mumbai, Bombay when it was under Portuguese rule, or maybe that entire northern province of Portugal. So these were areas when the Inquisition also was carried on later on. Okay, this is a photograph showing David Sassoon with his 3 sons. As you will notice that this photograph was taken, actually, it's in most of the books written on the Sassoon family. And you will notice that Sassoon, David Sassoon, his 2 sons are in traditional outfits. The son with the glasses on is Elias David Sassoon, or the founder of the E.D. Sassoon group. Now, when I passed by, I saw NTC House. NTC House used to be the E.D. Sassoon headquarters at one point. The other son, who's with the beard, and without glasses, is Sir Albert Sassoon. And that was the son, the last one, Sassoon, David Sassoon, who went to England. Now, this seemed to be just before he left, sometime in the late 1850s. Now, my ancestors, before they came to Bombay and became a little sort of anglicized, were traditional, they wore traditional village outfits. The women wore Nawari saris or 9-yard saris, sometimes with a nut. And the traditional necklace which a married lady wore was known as a lacha. It was a gold necklace with an 8-sided coin, octagonal coin. And the men, of course, you can see, the women are bare feet, but the men have shoes on, wearing a coat and with maybe a little headgear. Now, you can see from the photographs how culturally different the 2 communities really are. And Bombay really became a meeting place for them to really sort of come face to face and interact with each other. Sometimes the interactions were not very pleasant. And sometimes today, of course, a lot has been ground has been covered, and there's a lot more cultural understanding between the 2. Now, keeping these 3 aspects in mind, that is the sea, the fact that Bombay became a nerve center, and the fact that Jews never ever faced anti-Semitism here, let us explore the how, why, and when this trading community of Baghdadi Jews arrived in English East India Company, Bombay. What have been their economic and civic contribution to the city? And what is the institutional, religious, and cultural life of the Baghdadi Jewish community here in Bombay? This is from the Sarmaya collection, and it's up on the wall. I love the photograph because the Ben Israel Jews were basically, before they came here to Bombay in large numbers, this is a photograph taken in the 1830s, late 19th century. A lot of them studied in the Scottish missionary schools. So and they were so forward-looking because they were outside the caste system of the Hindu caste system. So they used to send both their girls and their boys to school. So they were very conscious about education. And in fact, even the Baghdadi schools, like Sir Jacob Sassoon's school in its early years, had Ben Israel teachers. So it was an educated community, and the education began in the villages themselves. And John Wilson took a great interest, the Anglican missionary, in the welfare of the Ben Israel community. Now, coming back to the early history of the Baghdadi Jews, I just want to talk a little about the Indian Ocean trading route, the medieval trading routes, and how they came here. Now, just a clarification before I proceed is that when we use the term Baghdadi Jew, it is used broadly and includes all Middle Eastern Jewry. So we are not talking just about Jews from Baghdad. We are talking about Jews from Syria, from Aleppo, from Basra, from Aden, and areas in and around Baghdad, and even communities. In fact, one of the Sassoon descendants, Rachel Manasseh, she passed away a few years ago. She wrote a wonderful book on the Baghdadians. And she says that the initial influx of the Baghdadi Jew basically was augmented by Persian Jews who came to Bombay and even Central Asian Jews. Now, I know of Baghdadi Jews in Bombay who are of Central Asian stock. They hail from Bukhara. I never knew that before. So if I met them, I'd say, okay, they're Baghdadi, they're fair, they sort of say the same prayers in the Babylonian manner, and they're Baghdadi. But no, there is a difference even between them of having the Gulf region Jews or the Iraqi Jews. There's a difference. There's the Persian Jews, there's the Central Asian Jews, and there are also the Afghan Jews. So keeping that in mind is that I've realized that there are 2 or 3 factors that bind this community together. First, ever since the destruction of the first Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE, Baghdad became the undisputed religious and cultural nerve center for Judaism, because Israel or Canaan, as we know it, was lost, and it was lost for centuries. It was to the ancient religious academies of Baghdad that Sephardic Jewish communities really flocked to. Now, Ben Israelis were not part of this network. They were a marooned community. They did not know anything about, they just followed a little bit about the religion. They would observe the Sabbath. They would eat kosher food. Okay, they knew what was clean and what was unclean. They followed the festivals on the due dates. But they were not religiously sophisticated as the Baghdadi community. Now, even the Kochini Jews, for that matter, followed the religious academies around Baghdad. They knew, they would ask if they had any kind of religious question or legal question, but each community basically regulates its own life. So this was where everyone went to for all the questions that they had. So this is one factor of Baghdad and its academy, religious academies, regulating the life of the Jews in the Indian Ocean trading world. And this is true even today, because the Babylonian or the Baghdadi Jews followed the the rabbinical sayings, while the Ben Israelis don't really, they just follow the Old Testament. Now, the second thing is that trade and trading opportunities brought the Baghdadi Jewish merchant to Indian shores. Their strong community and business links with other Baghdadi merchants based in port cities like Basra, like Jeddah, like Mocha and Aden, and further north to Cairo and Alexandria were the mainstays of their success. And they also connected with the Portuguese and the Spanish Jews who controlled the trade in the Mediterranean region. So the first substantial documentary proof, as I said, was basically the Geniza letters. Okay. Now, this is a fragment of the Geniza letter by Abraham Ben Eugene. Now, we must all remember that Amitav Ghosh based his novel In an Ancient Land on this fragment of letter. I was shown this letter when I was at the CAT Center because I knew the archivist really well, and it's a really prized possession. Now, unlike what Joseph Sassoon says in his latest book on the global merchants, in this letter, it's a mix of Arabic and Hebrew. So Hebrew is often written in the columns, in the sides, and there's Arabic script in the middle. So this letter is a letter by Abraham Ben Eugene after he traveled from Mangalore back to Cairo to Fustat. Now, the most well-known, so as I've told you that this is actually the roots of our knowledge about these maritime merchants. Now, coming back to Ben Eugene was unusual. He stayed for a very long time on Indian shores. He stayed for almost 14 years, if I rightly remember. But other merchants who came to the port cities along India's west coast and a little beyond were basically sojourners. They came here for a short time, they traded, they never settled. The first major settlement of Jews actually took place in the Mughal port of Surat. So Surat becomes very, very important and also a jumping point for this community from Surat to Bombay. And it's fascinating going to Surat because a lot of Surat is still, you can really trace the, for example, the English castle is still there. The river is not as full of water as it was. It's sort of silted up. But I was very lucky that when I went in 2015, a few of the gravestones of the old merchants, the Baghdadi merchants, I had a tough time. I took almost the whole day going cemetery to really locate the Baghdadi Jewish cemetery in Surat. And I found it. But finally, there were just 5 gravestones, and I don't know if it still exists. But there are records about their trade with Surat. But what is important is that Surat, after the political instability there, the Baghdadi merchants were encouraged to come to Bombay. Now, the earliest traders that came to Bombay was the Baghdadi Jew, was a Baghdadi merchant from Surat called Joseph Sema. Now, he came in 1730, which is quite early. But some community scholars say that the foundation of the community actually begins with the migration of Khoja Isaac David in 1770, Solomon Jacob Solomon and Yaqub Sema Nissim, both at the turn of the 19th century, as being foundational to the establishment of this community in Bombay. What is interesting is that the Ben Israelis were already here in the city. They had come around 1730s themselves, and by 1796, Bombay's first synagogue was established on Samuel Street. The synagogue still exists because everyone is so fascinated going to the Knesset Eliyahu, which is been beautifully restored by the JSW group, and it's accessible. This synagogue is in the middle of the native city, and it turned 225 years last year. So people are not aware of it. It's small. It is not the original synagogue that is standing. It was rebuilt in the early 19th century. But the fact is that synagogue has been there, and the Baghdadi merchants, which were a thin community of Jews, actually worshipped with the native Jews. So, I mean, this is just a little background about how they came and how they networked and how they were in touch with the trade that shifted to Bombay from Surat with the decline of Surat, and how they were also in touch with the East India Company residents and factors in the Indian Ocean port cities. So they knew what was happening here. But of course, there were certain push and pull factors, geopolitical pull and push factors to Jewish immigration to Bombay. One was Bombay was relatively politically stable and growing. Okay, so already traders enjoyed a good commercial relation with agents of the East India Company. Moreover, the attractiveness of the city increased with the coming of David Sassoon and family. So the minute David Sassoon arrived in Bombay in 1832 and nailed his mezuzah on 9 Tamarind Lane, I'm still trying to locate 9 Tamarind Lane. We still have a Tamarind Lane, actually, on Homi Modi Street. It's a lane that goes immediately on your right. And of course, the numbering of the street numbers have changed, but I just cannot get a map that shows me 9 Tamarind Lane. The fort walls were obviously still there at that point in time. And he began his counting house and his trading house on 9 Tamarind Lane. Now, so what were the pull factors? The pull factors were political stability, economic prosperity, promises of religious freedom, tax cuts for the first 5 years when you come and trade. The Armenians were given, in fact, even more incentives to come and settle in Bombay. The push factors were political instability, persecution in their hometown, floods, climate change, as you may call it, plagues, in the Baghdad region or towns where the Baghdadis came from. So what is the centrality of the Sassoon family of Baghdad? Now, I'm going to come to a question I was asked yesterday by someone. Were the Sassoons the only traders in Bombay, and why do you just keep talking about the Sassoons? So I'm going to come to that very soon. And I've got a little archival evidence to prove they weren't the only ones, but they were all related to each other. So finally, that made them all Sassoons. So, just excuse me. So the importance of the Sassoon family is simply this. As the Baghdadi Jews are a transnational trading community, community organization and institutions played an important part in fostering religious and cultural identity because there was no homeland, so they were a diaspora. They had no nation of their own. They were sort of dispersed in different port cities. So how do you hold a community together? So the Sassoon family was actually pivotal to this because David Sassoon was the son of Sheikh Sassoon, and they were the traditional Nasi or spiritual and community head of the Middle Eastern Jews. So they were the community leaders for the entire diaspora. And when David Sassoon, one of the first things when he came to Bombay, he began what was called the Hebrat Bet David. That means the house of David, where the Baghdadi Jews would come and separately worship, and there was a split between the worship between the Ben Israelis and the Baghdadis. So because he was already so well versed religiously, he was a religious man, and plus he regulated community life, he became important, and so did his family. One, as the head of the community, David Sassoon established institutions necessary to lead a Jewish life: synagogues, hospitals, and schools for his community members. The first Baghdadi school, I don't know if any of you all saw that wonderful exhibition at the Baghdadi Lad on the British Museum photographs of all the Baghdadi properties. It was held around 5 or 6 years ago. And in one photograph, the Magen David Synagogue in Baikala is shown with a Jewish school on the side, where the Sir Jacob Sassoon School still stands. I think that school was pulled down, and the Sir Jacob Sassoon School was rebuilt on the same site in 1903. Now, these schools were exclusively for the Baghdadi Jews. They had Ben Israeli teachers, but for many, many years, it was meant for the community. The second thing is, don't know if I've got photograph. The second thing is that this infrastructure became necessary because David Sassoon and Sons was attracting their fellow Baghdadi Jews to take employment in their businesses in India and overseas. So most of them, Bombay became the Sassoon headquarters. And because of that, people who came looking for jobs and employment from the community came to Bombay. They lived with their family in Bombay. They had a synagogue, they had a cemetery, they had a school, they had cultural organizations, and the youngsters were mentored in the counting house of David Sassoon and Sons, and then they were sent overseas to take charge of branch offices. Now this is important because some of the richest Jewish Baghdadi families today, like the Sir Eli Kaduri family of Hong Kong, had their roots in Bombay. They came to work. Sir Eli Kaduri worked with the Sassoon family, and when he was shifted to Shanghai, they broke away, the family broke away. Now, you know, the Kaduris are one of the richest Jews in the Far East. I mean, they own the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong, and in India, they've got the China Light Powerhouse Company in Haryana or Delhi or that area. So they are really rich, and this is one of the sort of virtuous fallouts. A lot of the Baghdadi boys who trained under the Sassoons really sort of branched out on their own. Another name that a lot of people won't be aware of is Silas Hardoon. Silas Hardoon became the biggest real estate developer in Shanghai, and some of his buildings still stand today. So this is how global the family was. So wherever they opened branch offices, whether at Canton, whether at Shanghai, whether in Indonesia, wherever, they sent their own people, by and large. And later, of course, when they went into manufacturing and all, they started recruiting people from other communities. But as far as the trading during the 19th century was concerned, it was mostly their own community people, by and large. This is a photograph of the Magen David. It was built by David Sassoon and in the 1860s. Now, I was talking about the original Jewish school. This school is a school where I'm a trustee of, the Sir Jacob Sassoon School. And this school has been redeveloped or rebuilt. So it was rebuilt by Sir Jacob Sassoon, the grandson of David Sassoon. So it is named after him. But there was a school standing on that very spot earlier. Now, by the time David Sassoon came here in 1832, just to recap, he was a conservative trader. He was not, he was not a Sir Jamshedji Jijiboy or a J.N. Tata who had these fantastic ideas and was really enterprising and willing to take the risk. He didn't have a risk appetite. He always rode the second wave, as it were. That's very important to note because he did not jump into the China trade immediately when the Parsi traders were all there, or the Boras or the Khojas, for example. Everyone was into the China trade, but he stuck to the West Asia trade. Now, but there were two important events that really triggered the growth of the Sassoon enterprises. One was the First Opium War between 1839 to 1842, which really opened 5 more port cities along the East China coast. The second event that took place and really triggered their fortune was the 1861 to 1865 cotton boom in Bombay and the stock market boom. So he did two things. He had 8 sons. I'm going to show you the family tree. He had 8 sons. Sorry. No, yeah, I've got it. The first 2 sons are by his first wife, Hannah Joseph, Albert or Abdullah, Elias, and he had 2 daughters. And then he had 6 sons by his second wife, Farah Himes. So Sir Jamshedji Jijiboy used to always joke. He said one of David Sassoon's greatest assets is the number of sons he has produced. He had a number of daughters also, and he was really strict with them. Each one had to undergo a vigorous training of going to every branch office, learning accounting, and they were all religiously brought up. Now, after the First Opium War and after this event, he did two things. He sent his son Elias in 1844 to open a branch office in China so that they could enter the China trade in a big way. Now, the China trade is often basically collated with the opium trade from Bombay and Calcutta, but there were other things. There was cotton was big. There was candy. There was indigo. There were many, many items in the spices. Part of the sandalwood, teak wood were all part of the China trade. But they entered the China trade only in 1844. The second major sort of play he made was he sent his son to London. He sent his third son, that is Sassoon David, to London. And London was then, now in my book, I've talked about London being the metropolitan city and one of the oldest financial centers. So London was where he felt it was important to have a son there to manage affairs so that money could be sent overseas. What happened with most India traders or traders in the China trade, the reason why a lot of Parsis and other traders, other communities got out of the China trade after the First Opium War was they could not get good bills of exchange to transfer their money back to India. So he felt it was important to have someone in the metropolitan city. Now, to just give you an idea about how big their business became, while everyone sort of fell away, David Sassoon and Sons and the Tata Company, David Sassoon by 1870s, the Sassoon family, were responsible for more than 1/3 of the entire Malwa opium trade from Bombay. So their trade in opium between the 1850s to almost the 1890s simply boomed. And in Joseph Sassoon's book, he talked about an average return of around 12 to 15% on the opium trade. So they not only began sourcing opium from Bombay, that in the Malwa opium, they also sourced the Bengal opium. Later, they began sourcing Persian opium. They began sourcing Turkish opium. So they were really big, but also big in other commodities like cotton. The second phase for them actually was that they entered into, now before I go into manufacturing, I just wanted to really talk about the civic contributions of David Sassoon. Now, we all know that most of the communities of Bombay, when they came to the city, they were given religious freedom. They were allowed to regulate their own community life. Most of them had little councils of elders who regulated community life. David Sassoon did a lot of endowments for his community, and even for the Baghdadi community. Anyone who came to David Sassoon's house at Messina Hospital, which is now Messina Hospital, was sure to return with some money for some charity, maybe in Jerusalem, or maybe in Cairo, or maybe in Aleppo, or wherever. And it's amazing that there is a cousin of mine is married to an English Jew, but of Sephardic origin. And he says there's an ancestor of mine who actually traveled to Bombay to get money for some charity or endowment or whatever. And one can't imagine that these histories are sort of still alive and people still trace back all these years. So what happened was that even before the 1860s, when Sir Bartle Frere said those famous words, let us all, after the stock market boom and the cotton boom, let us give back a little to a city that has given us so much. That was when all the Victorian and Neo-Gothic and Indo-Saracenic buildings started being built after the 1860s, but there was civic contribution even before that. Now, David Sassoon's contribution, he passed away in 1864, So we can see 3 of his contributions, civic contributions, are still standing. One is the David Sassoon Mechanics Institute and Library, which is now the David Sassoon Library. The second one is the clock tower at the Baghdadi Jews Museum. Then we have a statue of the Prince Consort with the Hebrew inscription at the base, which was donated by him. And of course, the citizens of Bombay donated the statue of David Sassoon to the Victoria and Albert Museum, today the Baghdadi Jews Museum, in his memory after he passed away. So there were civic contributions, and in Pune we all know about the David Sassoon Hospital, which is a major nodal hospital or district hospital in Pune today. Now, coming back again to really make you understand why this family really donated so much. They were always a very, very minuscule community, even at their peak. So the Ben Israeli community was larger, but the Baghdadi Jews were a really small community. I think at their peak, they were around, before independence, around 5,000 or 6,000 Jews. So it was not a big community. But the fact is that they were well integrated. Merchants in Bombay contributed to building institution and civic spaces. It was a collaboration between government and citizen. Now, this sort of philanthropy, or civic philanthropy, was continued by his sons, and it is the second generation that took to manufacturing. And they became but this was not before the two older brothers actually fought, or they fell out with each other. And in 1867, Sir Albert Sassoon and his younger brother, Sir Elias Sassoon, parted ways. So all the other 6 brothers went with Sir Albert in David Sassoon and Sons, and Elias formed his own branch, and they remained here in Bombay. So by the 1900s, we had the Sassoon family owning around 15 mills in the city, employing more than 15,000 workers. Now, it was here in their mills and manufacturing facilities that the Ben Israelis got employment in large numbers. So did the Baghdadis. So a lot of friendships today in Israel, for example, is of a Ben Israeli and Baghdadi having worked on the factory floor of a mill. And they've continued that friendship in Israel. So a lot of our Jews, at least from my community, worked at Mazgaon docks. They worked in the mill industry. They initially came to Bombay attracted by the jobs in the military, but they sort of lost those opportunities largely because they started forming community regiments, and the community was too small to really form a regiment. So the prospects for promotion actually went away. So they went into these kind of jobs. Now, by the late 19th century, early 20th century, David Sassoon and Sons, the entire family shifted to England, and the last member, direct descendant, was Lady Flora Sassoon, who was probably the first lady to head a business. She headed the David Sassoon and Company firms in Bombay. It had become a branch office by then. So by the early 20th century, she left too, because she was there was a lot of gitch-pitch, as I would call it, a lot of sort of correspondence. They were criticizing her. They were all in England. The men were all in England, and she was managing things on her own. And she was the granddaughter of Sir Albert Sassoon, the head of the firm, but she was married to his brother, Suleiman, or Solomon Sassoon. And they lived in a bungalow, which is today the WIA Club. That property was actually Flora Sassoon's home. And she left for England just in the early half of the 20th century, and the companies were handed over to Englishmen or foreigners who were sort of running it, and well, it trotted along. But the E.D. Sassoon group continued in Bombay, and they continued donating to the city. They were doing very, very well. Their mills were the most modern mills. And they also, I had written a book on the Dwarkadas family of Bombay. And one of the members of the Dwarkadas family, Kanji Dwarkadas, who was a very good friend of Rati Petit or Rati Jinnah, was actually the person who looked after the mill workers, or what we call human resource management. So the Sassoon mills were one of the first to actually, they were sort of modern in their outlook. They were modern, but they also had a modern way of managing people. And they were the first mills actually to reduce working hours in the city. Now, the last Sassoon member here was Sir Victor Sassoon. And he took over, he was a grandson of Elias Sassoon. And he took over the running of both the David Sassoon Group and the E.D. Sassoon Group. The E.D. Sassoon Group were known for their mills. Now, if anyone wants to ask me questions on why they left, Victor Sassoon had no confidence. He was very involved in the politics of Bombay. He was a member of the Bombay Legislative Assembly. He headed the Mill Owners, Bombay Mill Owners Association. But he had no confidence on what the future of this country had after independence. So he wound up, he sold all the mills overnight, and he shifted to Shanghai. And he was great friends with the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, and his wife. And he felt that Shanghai, being such a cosmopolitan city, they had a lot of property and real estate in Shanghai, had a great future. But unfortunately for him, in 1949, with the Communist Revolution, Shanghai was occupied and they had to pack up everything and flee. So he says, I left India, but Shanghai, I had to leave Shanghai too, or I don't get the exact word. I left India, but China left me. So then after that, sort of, the family actually did not really get back that way. They had sort of dispersed. They were more sort of, they didn't have that fire for entrepreneurship and running companies, or were willing to put in that hard work. But there are a lot of eminent members from this family, and I believe even today, there is a family member who is a sitting MP in the English Parliament. So the Sassoon family is still there. Now, what I wanted to, coming back to the question, were there other Jewish Baghdadi merchants, or are we only talking about the Sassoon family? Now, this is an 1862 Times of India directory and yearbook. And we have, and you can see the names of all the Jewish merchants of Bombay. Of course, we have Abdullah or Sir Albert David Sassoon, David Ezekiel, David Moshi, David Sassoon, of course, Elias David Sassoon, E.I. Abraham, but most of them, the Gabbes, the Shaloms, the Abrahams, the Moshis, the Ezekiels, the Reubens, the Natha, Mullah Abraham Natha was a Persian Jew, were all married or intermarried within the large Sassoon family. So we did have plenty of Baghdadi merchants. And of course, most of you all know that the Baghdadi community is well known. A lot of the women took to the film industry. They were actresses. There was a famous director who founded the films division of India. But in this early period in the 19th century, there were merchants, but they were not as big as the Sassoon or as central to the community life of the Sassoons. So what I just want to really sum up is I mentioned the reasons for Aliyah were basically Indian independence combined with the formation of the State of Israel. It was the formation of the State of Israel that most of the Ben Israeli and the Kochini Jews actually uprooted themselves and left. So they left actually more for ideological reasons. They wanted to lead a religious way of life. They wanted their children to marry other Jews. So if one family uprooted, all of them sort of went. They felt because the Ben Israelis were a lower middle class community, they felt they had better economic opportunities in Israel. and they wanted to build the Holy Land. So there was one set of reasons. The Baghdadis left because they felt there was no future here without British rule. But more important was that many of them were employed in Sassoon enterprises. And with the Sassoon enterprises being closed down, a lot of them lost their means of livelihood. So that was another trigger that made them go there. Now immigration really peaked during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. It's still continuing today. We still have that stray Ben Israel family in the village, and the entire family goes to Israel. They still undertake Aliyah. But what is interesting for us is that the Jewish heritage of Bombay and India is still there. And the 80 to 85,000 Jews, Indian Jews, who are in Israel, now make it a point to come back. They are reiterating their Indian identity. And with the good relations between India and Israel, most of them have taken PIO status. So they can come and go as and when they want to, and they are contributing to the maintenance of a lot of these institutions. And they found that in the Middle East, most of their synagogues and schools and all have been destroyed, but everything is intact here in India. So India now has become like an attraction for these communities. They come during December, January, and March during the cooler season. And we now have a movement to have an Indian Jewish Heritage Center. Now, this Heritage Center holds lectures almost every week on a Thursday, Israel time, on different aspects about Indian Jewish history. So it's a very, very active community. They're suddenly, after years of the first pioneers working hard to set themselves up, the children and grandchildren again are rediscovering their Indian roots. So I'd like to stop here and just take you through a few of my slides. Of course, this is the second generation Sassoon philanthropy. We have the David Sassoon Library with the Kala Ghoda. This is the Elphinstone building. Does anyone recognize this, where it is? This is right next to St. Xavier's College. It is known as the Elphinstone Technical College. The Royal Institute of Science also was endowed by Sir Jacob Sassoon, as was a large donation to the Gateway of India. These are the little stickers, paper stickers that were put on bales of cloth for the Sassoon mills. So you can see, of course, one of them has got David Sassoon, but a lot of them have got Indian religious themes, Sant Tukaram and that lady there. And of course, Sassoon docks. How can we forget Sassoon docks? I mean, it's one of the most iconic structures here. It was built by Sir Albert Sassoon and then gifted or sold to the city. And I'd like to stop here.
Thank you, Sifra. Thank you. Any questions?
Just, you talked about the Baghdadi Jews and the migration. What is the current population of Baghdadis in Bombay, and what is their future? Because there seem to be very small number available now.
Actually, there may be just less than 100, or less, I would say.
Far
almost
less, I would imagine.
30 to 40 people, I would say.
And what is their future of the community?
As I was just telling someone recently, one of the Sassoon descendants, Rabbi Menashe, he passed away 2 years ago, and he became a trustee on the board of the Knesset Eliyahu. And he heads a seminary in New York, and he used to take a great interest in all the Sassoon religious institutions in Bombay and in the vicinity, even Pune. He was there, I remember meeting him at the Ohel David 150-year celebration. So he passed away, and I believe members, Mr. Pereira said quite a few people have come from overseas, probably had come for his memorial service. So there are people who are coming and going, and there is a great interest by the community in their heritage here. So it's important for them.
Yeah. So, Sifra, you spoke about the Baghdadi Jews, the pulls and pressures which made them come to India. The Ben Israelis, who you said were a much larger sort of group, and they came prior. It seemed, if I got it right.
Right.
What were the pulls and pressures? What made them come to India? And a question completely unrelated to that. You also spoke about the synagogue and the fact that it had to be rebuilt. The one which was restored by JSW Foundation. It had to be rebuilt in the 1900s, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I think you're mixing two up. The synagogue that had to be rebuilt was the 1796 Ben Israel synagogue, the Gate of Mercy synagogue.
Okay. So that synagogue, was it, when they rebuilt it, was it completely built by the Jews or was there any help?
No, it was built by the Ben Israel Jews.
Completely built
by the Ben Israel. But where, the convergence took place was that the Ben Israel Benevolent Society, the education school, the school that they had, Sir Eli Kaduri of Shanghai endowed the building at Masga for that school, and they sort of named the school after him. So it's known as the Sir Eli Kaduri School, but it is a Ben Israel school.
Okay, so he belonged to the...
He belongs to the Baghdadi community, yeah.
Okay, and what made the Ben Israelis come to India in the first place?
They actually were shipwrecked. See, we have an older community of Jews in Cochin. They are known as the Malabar Jews. I'm not talking about the white Jews of Cochin, who we know, where, we are all aware of the beautiful synagogue, Pardesi synagogue in Jewtown. But the Malabar Jews are I don't want to use the term, they are of the same complexion as the Ben Israelis. And they were spice traders. They used to come along the coast. They were part of the Indian Ocean trading route. And some scholars have speculated, there's no archival evidence, that maybe one or two ships of those Jews got shipwrecked. It was dangerous because it was in the days of sail. You didn't have sort of steamships at those times. And this was like centuries ago, 1,600, 2,000 years ago. So it was a coasting route. So there was maybe a few, one or two ships got shipwrecked, and they were marooned here on the west coast. Yeah, just south of Bombay.
And where did they come from? Where did they come from?
There are scholars studying that. One very strong theory is they probably are of Yemenite origin. Yeah. They came from the Hadramaut, they're of Yemenite origin, and a lot of these scholars come, they call me up, and we discuss their work and all. And one scholar told me, he's an American scholar, he says that you look very Yemeni. There's a Ben Israel look. So he says, if you see, you've got a very Yemeni look. So he says there's no evidence, but there's speculation, that we probably came from somewhere in the Middle East.
And the Jewish community from the northeast, where did they come from?
See, they are also consider themselves a lost tribe. They were also a maroon community like the Ben Israelis, but they have been discovered more recently in the 1970s. So they also followed some sort of remnant of the religion, and they have been retutored in the religion in much the same ways that the Ben Israelis were 300 years ago. Yeah, so they're still not recognized by the state of Israel, but they've been retutored, they're allowed to immigrate to Israel, they're living there, and I think it's a matter of time before they are sort of recognized as Jews, full-fledged Jews.
Ma'am, your talk demolishes the perception that Jews came to India because of religious persecution in different parts of the world. But now it seems that they came here for the purpose of trade. And this is a trend which was followed by Arabs also on the East African coast, and probably the origins of the people who came to India, the Jewry, they also came from the same locations.
Right.
So where do we stand? I mean, was there religious persecution against Jews that brought them to India, or was it really trade that brought them to India?
I think it's a combination of both, because I mentioned that they were already familiar with these port cities. Most of them came for short periods and they went back, but they came to settle actually when they felt the prospects were better and there was relative political and economic stability and no persecution. That's when they came to settle. That was the reason why David Sassoon came to settle. He was in touch with the East India Company residents and factors in all these port cities like Basra. They had a political resident in Baghdad, in Bushehr. So they were well versed, these communities were well versed with what was happening here in India. They'd probably even traveled to Surat and Bombay. So before actually making the move. But because of tensions at home, it was a trigger. Sometimes it could also be outbreaks of plague, which it was. It could be outbreaks of plague, it could be climate change, it could be a drought, which was very often the reason for internal migrants to come into the city. They came in waves because no one wants to really uproot themselves unless they're actually starving or they feel they're getting better opportunities. That's the case even today, for that matter.
There was a flood which caused the migration from Muziris to Kochi.
Yes, yes.
In 1341.
And not only that, Ms. Abraham, Muziris was the river. Periyar actually changed course, you know.
Yeah, but there are a lot to answer it in a little bit from my perspective. You got another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just
were traded. Why was opium high on the list? I mean, forgive the pun, but why was it high on the list of? Probably many of their, philanthropic activities were financed by profits gained from this trade.
yeah, absolutely. Opium was illegal in China from 1729, and it was a high profit trade. There was a high margin because it was contraband. So the East India Company didn't want to dirty its hands. I've written about it in my book. So what they did was in Bengal, they controlled the trade completely, the growing, the packing, everything. But then they had auctions in Calcutta to sell the opium and made the Indian merchants carry the opium to China and smuggle it in, along with the official commodities like cotton and spices and all. So you had these little dragon boats coming down the Pearl River. They'd meet the ships in, it was called Lentin Island, and they'd put the contraband on those little dragon boats. Dragon boats would take them in, and the ships would go with all the official goods into Canton. So because it was contraband, it was in high demand, the profits were high. But after a point, after 1880s, the profit margins became really slim, and when they forced the Chinese emperor to actually make it an official trade. By 1913, opium was sort of, the opium trade was stopped.
Sifra, if we can take one last question.
Yeah. Okay.
Any one last question, sir?
Was there any, if you now research with the Indian Jews who have returned to Israel,
Right.
is there any Indian cultural trait that they've carried back with them, any practice which distinguishes them as Indian Jews?
Of late, in fact, I wouldn't even say of late. In the 1990s, Sharad Pawar had gone to Jerusalem for a Marathi conference. So, the Ben Israeli Jews, they have a Marathi paper there, and they still have their, their kirtans in Marathi. So they are quite proud of their heritage. And it's not just true of the Indian Jews, it's true of all the communities. Each one today, earlier, of course, with Zionism and all, they were building a new country. It was largely desert. They lived in moshavs and in kibbutz, and there was a certain uniformity, But today, the entire society has changed there. Each community is reasserting its regional and its identity. So it's very common for a Ben Israel, even in Israel, to say that India is my motherland, but Israel is my fatherland. So it's a very common saying, but it's got meaning to it. So a lot of them also continue speaking Marathi there. They have Marathi newsletters. They have get-togethers, singing kirtans, especially among the older women. And now with this new Indian Jewish Heritage Center, which they're doing with the Portuguese, it's a big project and it's going to be really nice.
So they're not shunning this, they're celebrating this.
They're celebrating the identity, yes.
Just curious, the term Baghdadi Jew seems to cover a range of people from very different cultural backgrounds.
Right.
So how did they get the name Baghdadi Jew?
As I mentioned right at the beginning, Baghdad, after the fall of Jerusalem, basically became the religious and cultural center of the Jews, especially the Jews in the East. So those who follow, and you have a Jerusalem Talmud, which was formed. Now, a Talmud is basically rules, it was basically dialectics between rabbis on how to conduct your life, how a divorce should be given, how an erring merchant should be treated, basically day-to-day life. Now, Ben Israelis don't follow a Talmud, but the Babylonian Talmud was basically put together in 6th century AD. And it became a center for religious and cultural life for all Eastern Jewry. So whether it was Persian, or whether it was Iraqi, or whether it was from Syria, or whatever, they all followed the Babylonian ways.
So that way they got a common identity.
In that sense, they have a common religious and cultural identity.
Culturally, they would have been different.
Yeah, slightly different, but they sort of just absorbed the other communities in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sifra. I'm sure you can find her after the talks. Sifra's book is available outside for sale, so please go pick them up. Thank you all for coming. Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.